Well, hello, NATR 346, and welcome to this introduction to the Delta. It's in Module 11. I just wanted to show you what's in there. There is a study guide. I think for this little mini unit, I don't want to assign problems to do or even essays to write. However, um, the study guide has 5 questions or essay type questions about the Delta that I would want to be fair game in the future, like on a final. So read those questions before going into this stuff, and maybe that will help guide kind of note taking and all that. I'm going to be talking off these lecture notes in a minute. There's a couple of really educational and interesting videos in here too. This one is about the future of delta levees that we're going to talk about during this talk. A short little video about one of the levee failures that is historically interesting. And then I don't go into the California water fix, the delta tunnels, in too much detail here. There's obviously a lot there to get into. I just want to cover what that project is and provide some literature and information of why it might be a good idea. And then also, this tunnel opposition letter, I think, is one of the better compilations of a lot of environmental agencies stating why it's not a good idea in their opinion. Here's another little video, kind of a propaganda video for the pro tunnel argument, just so you understand, the basics of why would you build the tunnel project and why not. So for the lecture material, I just want to get started here going over the basics of the California Delta region and why it's so important for California water. First of all, to note, when we say so much water comes out of the Delta, or the Delta provides 40% of California's water, or whatever, that's kind of annoying to me because really there's nothing magic about it. The Delta just happens to drain an enormous watershed. About 40% of the water that falls on California ends up in this watershed and drains out the Delta. So it's not like the Delta provides water from some magic source. All it does is collect water from a very large watershed. And this is another map that shows the outline of the watershed. Here, this purple watershed, all this water that falls in this vast area eventually flows into the Delta. But what's also interesting about this map is the brown areas outside of the watershed that use Delta water. So this is like classic water 1.0, starting with the Romans, that if you're down here in the desert and you want some water and you want to grow your population or agriculture, go to another watershed and snag the water out of that watershed. And that's what our California water infrastructure is all about. We just happen to use the Delta as an access point to get to all the water in this watershed because it flows and collects there. I want to do a quick diversion here too, which I think is interesting about how the Delta was formed. This map is of the Monterey Bay, but I'm showing it here to illustrate the physiography of the ocean, Pacific Ocean. And here is the San Francisco Bay. These are the Farallon Islands where my hand is here, and this is a continental shelf out here. And so I want to illustrate over the last 18,000 years, basically, how the Delta was formed. As 18,000 years ago, the sea level started to rise, and it rose about 340 feet. And it flooded the Delta and caused the Delta to be what it is today. So this is an illustration. It's not very graphically sophisticated, but what it does, it was put together by Stanford University climatologists. And what it attempts to do is show you what was going on 17,000 years ago. The K is 1,000, and I guess the A is years ago. What did this look like 17,000 years ago when the sea level was down 340 feet about during the last ice age? And you can see here's the Sacramento River, and here's the San Joaquin River, and they come in together in a confluence, and they make their way out of what is now the Carquinez Strait and out through what is now the Golden Gate. But if you were to be cruising around 17,000 years ago, the Golden Gate would not be that spectacular. It would be about a 250-foot gorge here with a river cutting through and out to the ocean. And here would be the shoreline way out here near the Farallon Islands. And as sea level rose, you can see how the delta begins to form. And first, San Francisco Bay forms here as the sea level rises. Now San Francisco Bay forms, but there's very little elevation difference between the delta region and the sea level in San Francisco Bay. So that really, the bay formed at about the same time that the delta formed. And about 2,000 years ago, you had just a giant inland fresh water body, or brackish water body. And as these drainages, the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River, that were draining out the bay, encountered this freshwater, this stagnant water body, that loses its energy to carry its load, and it drops its load, and dropped fine silts and clays, and grew marshes, and grew a lot of vegetation, and that vegetation then dies and accumulates and forms peat. So what happened in this area here is accumulation of peat, and that's basically what the delta is all about, is a thick interval of peat accumulation. And so here we go. This is in 1890 when we were first coming out here and settling and developing the area. We looked at this and said, hey, this could be really great farmland if we developed it and put levees on all these drainages. And I'll illustrate that later in the problem with that plan. And so anyway, it just kind of loops over to what it looks like now. Anyway, I hope that's an interesting illustration. But anyway, the delta was formed as a response to sea level rise. And this is just a schematic of what it looks like under the Golden Gate Bridge. As the Sacramento-San Joaquin River goes out the Carquinez Strait and through the Golden Gate Bridge, this is the topography that was formed over many hundreds of thousands of years, and then was pretty much just recently flooded in, giving us the current delta configuration. So I want to get into this a little bit in more detail because it really illustrates a big unsustainable practice and problem that we have in the delta now. So here's a cartoon of the pre-development condition that in the video I just showed around 1890 what it looked like, which were natural channels with natural levees separated by big areas of bulrush and reed species, but also peat soils formed from decaying vegetation over thousands of years. So here is just a big old, 50, 100 foot or greater thickness of peat. And this makes for a vibrant ecosystem. But at the turn of the century, we were all focused on agriculture, and we would look at something like this and say, wow, I could grow food on here if I merely lowered the water table. Here's the water table that you all are so familiar with now, basically at the ground surface. It's a marsh. If I just dug a trench, and this is like 1900s kind of technology, I dig a trench in this stuff, I put a pump in, I suck out the water, I'll put the water in this channel over here, and then I've got some nice dry peat soils. And there's certain crops that love peat soils, like asparagus specifically. So this is what we've done. The problem with this is that when you take this peat muck soil and dry it out and expose it to oxygen, it decomposes. It literally, it doesn't just blow away. Some of it blows away in the wind, but a lot of it just simply oxidizes and turns into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's lost. So now you have the surface dropping down. The water is set by the sea level. That stays the same. The sea level is going to either rise or stay the same. And so that results in, over time, you're going to have to build up these levees. And so over the last 100 years, we've been continuously fortifying and building up these levees. And now we're up to about 15 to 20 feet of elevation change from where sea level is and where these islands are. And that's creating a very unstable condition. This is an example of digging a trench, putting pumps in it and pumping out the water, and farming this dry soil, but the soil then decays and declines. And so this is another illustration of that same issue. And now we're sitting here in the 2000s with high levees and the scenario of a levee failure, which has happened and will happen in the future. And this map here illustrates islands that have been formed in the light blue that are 15 feet below sea level. And that's what's resulted from this practice. And what keeps the ocean out of these islands and what keeps the ocean from coming into the delta are these dirt levees. And there's about 1,000 miles of levees throughout the delta. And the levees isolate these islands that are privately owned and used for agriculture. Here's another map of the, I guess I'd say about 1,100 miles of delta, of levee. And so the deal is, if one of these levees break, what will happen is, again, the water will rush in to fill in these depressed islands. And the water will come from the ocean. And that water will be salty. And if you recall in the infrastructure talk, you see the Tracy Pumping Plant and the Harvey O. Banks Pumping Plant. This is the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project pulling water out of the delta and sending it down south. Well, if the big gulp happens, they call it, if these levees break and the salt water comes in, the salt water will then get sucked into these pumps. And then LA will be getting salty water for their drinking water. That's not going to work. Also, the Central Valley Project will be getting salty water to irrigate crops. That's not going to work. And so this is known to be an unsustainable situation. But check out that video on the delta failure, the delta and levees, and you'll see the different attitudes about it. It's really interesting. But I think intuitively, you can see that this thing that we're doing right now, starting in 1880 to now, is just not sustainable. These levees can't. What are we going to do? Change things when the levees are 50 feet high? It's getting kind of to the tipping point now, a lot of people feel. So there's also a, well, I have a little illustration here. Let's see. How levees fail and why you see riprap on them. This is just a silent cartoon showing, that's why a lot of times you'll see speed limits around levees to stop this wave action, because it can be brutal on the performance of a levee. And this just illustrates, okay, you get a weakness going, and then if there's a flood situation and more water pressure, there you go. That's how a levee can fail. It's not a pretty sight. And, we're just kind of waiting for it to happen, frankly, at the Delta, the way we're managing it. So that's a really nice thing to think about. So this is what it looks like. It's kind of spectacular. This is a picture of the Delta, one of the channels in the Delta. This is farmland. It looks kind of wet and flooded maybe from rain. But this is 15 or 20 feet of elevation here. It's not hard to imagine. And this is just dirt. So it's not too hard to imagine what would happen, how hard it would be for one of these levees to fail, and what would happen, just a massive flood. Here's the same thing that, you can drive on the levees. Highway 4 is built on the levee. And to the right is the sea level that's channel going out to sea, and to the left is the farmed area. And it's this farmed area here and here and here. It's just going to continue to drop as more and more pumping out of the water, putting it in the levee, oxidizing the soil, and lowering the land surface. That's a gigantic issue with the Delta. This is what a levee failure looks like, and the video goes into this in more detail. Just the levees are just dirt. There's nothing magic about them. So shifting gears here a little bit back to the kind of the infrastructure part. Where does the water go that's pumped out of the Delta? What's that look like? And I think this page out of the California Water Plan is a very good illustration of kind of the big picture of what the Delta water budget looks like. Basically, most of the water comes from the Sacramento River. 21 million acre feet come in, and about 21 million acre feet leave. But the other, there's other water that comes in from the Mokelumne River and Cosumnes River, San Joaquin River. You get about 1 million acre feet of rain right on the Delta. You lose about 2 million acre feet to consumptive use right in the Delta, farming. And so what they say is about a quarter of the water that would normally naturally flow out of the delta is pumped down south. So this South Bay, California aqueduct, 2.5 million acre feet. Delta Mendota Canal, that's the Central Valley Project, 2.5 million acre feet. So we pull out 5 million acre feet that would otherwise flow through the delta. And that causes a lot of problems for the delta ecosystem. And there's a lot of warring going on about how much water is environmentally prudent to remove from the delta like this. And this you will see this is old hat for you all with the control of salinity intrusion in the delta. But just to point out, looking forward to maybe a couple of foot sea level rise, that will exacerbate this problem, won't it? If we have droughts and sea level rise, that really combines to push saltwater intrusion further in. If there's less fresh water to push out and a couple of feet of rise, again, those combine that in the future we're going to have more challenges keeping the salt water out of the delta. This is a nice diagram. I think I had something like this for the infrastructure talk too, just to give you an overview. I wouldn't ask you to memorize these numbers, but kind of the whole big picture of where water goes in California. This is something that we can be kind of proud of, the wild and scenic designation up here. Lots of rain, and we're not damming or capturing or moving this water. This is 22,000 acre feet. That's 22 million acre feet of rainfall falling on wild and scenic watersheds and going out to ocean undisturbed. Fantastic up here. Everything else, all these other chunks are dammed and put into the infrastructure system. This is a quick overview of who uses the delta water. So here's the delta, and then up north of the delta, these red bars show delta water exports. Of course, we don't take water from the delta and move it up north. It comes from the north and we're moving it south. San Francisco Bay gets a little bit of the water. They don't need that much because they've got Hetch Hetchy. But as you can see, most of this delta water goes to this hot, dry desert area with excellent soils and flat land and to make the breadbasket of the world. So you're really looking at water leaving this triangle and heading down here to grow the fruits and vegetables for the country. Less so going to urban areas on the south coast. And you'll see in the future more and more how the central and south coast are trying to wean themselves off of delta water because they can see the writing on the wall. It's going to be harder and harder to get this water out of the delta. Folks are fighting back and wanting to leave more in stream and do delta restoration. And so these folks are looking at using the ocean and desalinating, using recycled water that we saw earlier, and make this reliance on this red bar less and less. One of the big challenges with managing California water is, you'll hear it over and over again, is variability in the precipitation. And the class sort of started there when we went to the weather stations and saw the intense variability. This is just another chart to refresh your memory on this. Wild variation in the inches of rain that California receives. On average, it's about 22 inches. But that doesn't really mean very much, because what matters is what happens in any given year. Here in 1923-24 was a record historic drought, and that actually inspired development of the California water projects. It's just that, again, we were planning it and ready to build Shasta Dam and all that, but the Depression hit and we didn't have the funding, so the federal government came in and did that for us, and that's why we have so much federal involvement in our water. But here in the mid-20s, because of this drought, the seawater had intruded way up the delta, and there were saltwater barnacles growing on farmers' piers, and they were not happy about it. And that really was one of the inspirations for building Shasta Dam and the whole water projects. But you can also have, flood years. And so managing this range of precipitation is what the big challenge is for California. Digging in a little bit more on the managing the saltwater intrusion. One of the tools that the Department of Water Resources and Army Corps and the feds use is trying to control the flow of water through the delta so that when we're in a drought situation, when we don't have a lot of fresh water to release to push through here, we'll put up barriers to try to prevent the salt water from coming in. And we'll also control the flow of water through the channels. This is a famous facility in the delta. So this is like pilings that block the flow of water and these gates that control. So the idea here is that when tide is out, you open the gates and allow the fresh water out and to flush out the delta. When tide rises, you close the gates and prevent the salt water from coming in in an attempt to kind of make a one-way valve here for fresh water to go out to the delta and salt water to stay away. Another way to do the same thing, it's a little more crude, and they kind of do it only as like an emergency measure, is during a severe drought, drive these pilings into the channels to stop the flow altogether. And this is a picture of them building one of these, and it's a temporary structure. After the drought is over, it's removed. Boaters, of course, hate this because you can't get through. It disrupts all kinds of recreation, but this is how it's an attempt to prevent seawater from intruding into the delta. Another picture of building one of these things, kind of interesting. So let's see, where did I want to go from here? This is a nice map of the delta to study again. You've got these two big pumping plants that suck water out of the delta. Ultimately, this water, of course, comes from the Sacramento watershed, the San Joaquin watershed, but this is where the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project accesses that water out of the watershed. And this is just a real simple diagram that illustrates sort of one of the problems with the current system. On the left is kind of generalized flow lines that you'd expect in a natural system. San Joaquin River coming in, Sacramento River coming in, Cosumnes River coming in, and all converging and flowing out the Carquinez Strait in the natural system. When you turn on these two big old pumps down here in the South Delta, it redirects the flows. This water that would otherwise flow out gets sucked into the pump. You get a lot of direct flow. They encourage that. They've built some channels to try to get the Sacramento River to flow directly into the pump. But you can also get reversal of flows, and that wreaks havoc on the ecosystem of the delta above and beyond channelizing all these things. And so this is one of the rationales for the WaterFix project that you've probably heard about, the tunnels. The concept here is instead of, you're still going to keep the same facilities that pump water from this location down into the canals, but instead of having that water get sucked in through all the surface water, the idea is to take the Sacramento River up here around Hood, make it go underneath the ground, a couple 100 feet or so, the tunnels, and then pop up and deliver the water to the pumps there, thereby bypassing all these surface water channels and preventing this kind of a flow problem. So this is what the twin tunnel project looked like. I guess Governor Newsom came in and said, no twin tunnels, we're just going to do one tunnel, and so they're evaluating that. Either way, it's the same concept. And there's, it's a controversial project, obviously. It's extremely expensive. But one of the reasons that you'll see in the little advocating videos that I posted is Southern California is very upfront about this. And they say, look, you guys, we know you're going to have an earthquake. It's California. We know the levees are going to fail. We know the salt water is going to intrude, and we don't want to be caught bringing in seawater. So we want this delivery of our fresh water from the Sacramento secured. If you guys have an earthquake and your delta is all a bunch of salty seawater, well, that's bad on you. We're going to have a nice fresh pipeline of fresh water to feed our houses and farms. And, that's kind of cold, but that's the way it is. And so that's one of the reasons they call it modernizing, but, there's a lot of different opinions about that. So I just included some basic fact sheets. They're a little bit old, but just to kind of, just so you know basically what the tunnel project is about, where it would take in water, the path of the pipeline, and where it would deliver water, just again to the existing facility. And benefits, a lot, some of the literature on the proponents of the project. And one of the things they point out, a lot of the people say, hey, this is a water grab. They're going to take all the water from Northern California and send it down south. And the counter to that is, no, they're not going to take more water. They're just going to deliver it in this more reliable manner. And they're hammering out agreements to say, in a wet year, this is how much we can take. In a dry year, this is how much we can take. If it's a really dry year, we're not going to take any. So they're really, I mean, it gets more complicated than just a simple case of, oh, this is Southern California taking Northern California's water again. But that definitely weighed into some of the opposition to two tunnels versus one tunnel. So we'll see where that goes. I posted a letter, and again, it's a little bit old, but it really is a comprehensive letter put together by a large coalition of environmental groups, laying out the case against this conveyance plan. It's a long letter. I'm not assigning it necessarily, but I do provide some sort of pro WaterFix videos and fact sheets. And so I wanted to at least put up the anti. And you could scan it and get a flavor for really what their rationale is as to why the tunnel project isn't a good idea. And I frankly don't know their arguments for guarding against the big gulp. They'd probably want to restore the delta so that it was more stable. And that's the last slide I want to cover here, is just as a placekeeper for a lot of habitat restoration that's going on and planning for the delta to address this levee failure problem. They're looking at shallow flooding. So, instead of waiting for the levee to fail big, get it to fail many times slowly and expand back the size and width of these channels so the levees don't have to be 20 feet high. Maybe they can go back to being 10 feet high, and then we have a lot of marsh habitat being created. The problem with that is, who is going to give up their land to be a new floodplain for the delta? But there's still a lot. Part of the WaterFix involves very deliberate restoration of some of the islands, and so this is definitely being looked at. Check out this fact sheet. I think this is USGS, and it just gives you a flavor for some of the kind of habitat restoration and planning that is going on. The problem is, I think, just the scale of it. You can restore one of the islands, but there's like 40 others. So it's a giant unsustainable practice that we're doing in the Delta now, and we'll see where it goes. Hope that's interesting.